Central and Eastern Europe, plus the Baltics, have become Europe. Post-Soviet countries, much less so. But I should say that it's not to argue that everything is predetermined. So in 2003, Georgia had a regime change, and the new government said we'll clean out the corruption. And more or less they actually did. And some of that is still persistent even though the government is out. And members of this government are actually not coming back to the country. But the current government of Georgia now says we are not post-Soviet, we want to be part of it. You look at Serbia, and this is coming back to your second question. You look at Serbia today, Serbia has never been too pro-Western. And yet, the government, this government, or that government, the previous government, in the last 10 years, they want to become part of the EU. And in that sense, EU still remains a role model for many, many reasons. Because it's still less corrupt, it's still more prosperous, it's still more socially cohesive. Now, whenever you need, for your nationalistic or populistic reasons, to criticize Europe, you always find a problem in Europe. Refugees, crisis, inefficiency of Brussels, too much regulation, too little regulation, very high taxes. So you can actually say Europe is doomed. But I think the very important revealed preference argument is you open up the Panama Papers, Panama Leaks, and you see that the very people who come out and say Europe is doomed, they always send their kids to Europe, they move their assets to Europe, and so on. So I think for rhetoric reasons, a lot of these people try to convince their public that Europe is bad. But still, personally, they believe in Europe. And also, whenever you have accountability, you have the movement to Europe. And let me also mention another example of Moldova. So Moldova is a very small country which is divided in the following sense. There are localities which send their temporary workers to Russia. And there are localities which send their temporary workers to Romania or Italy, for that matter. So these are two different countries in terms of attitude, support for reform, attraction to Europe, and so on. So the Russia-connected households vote communist. Europe-connected households vote liberal. And in that sense, it's not clear to what extent there is an answer right now. But overall, the divide goes through this 1939 line eventually. And this is where persistence is, and also this is where the success has been so far. But some countries have escaped the curse, and some countries actually have joined the curse, in the sense that Moldova was part of Moldova was part of the West before 1930s. Part of Belarus and Ukraine was part of the West before 1940s, and yet now it's part of kind of former Soviet story. But yes, answer to your second question is, I think there are many failings in Europe, and whoever wants to find them manages to find them. But they do that in a very hypocritical way themselves.
Thank you very, very much. Let me now use the microphone to direct questions from the audience. Yes.
Hi. Well, I want to focus on the communist countries that didn't succeed in what you were saying to us. And moreover, the problem is, like you said, that they're going in a populist direction. I want to ask, what will happen? Because, like Professor Tabellini said, they have no positive history or positive democratic history, and as you said, they're more sensible to more populism. If this is the situation, the nations which reverse the reforms, how are they going to reverse the reversion? Is the dictatorship the only outcome possible, or is there a way out from this?
So all countries which are democratic now, all countries in the West, or the West including Korea and Japan, I guess, that are democratic now, at some point were not democratic, right? Okay. And in that sense, we don't know how long it's going to take, but I think that eventually, what we see, democratic regimes are more resilient to shocks, are more prosperous, they provide checks and balances that investors like, and in that sense, eventually the dictatorial regimes lose out and get overthrown. Now we see, for example, in North Africa, that not everybody is undergoing a peaceful transition for the better, let's put it mildly. And in that sense, the turbulence may be quite long and quite painful, but I think in the long run, the democracy and capitalism will prevail. But yes, I should tell you that dictators are not stupid. They don't want to lose their jobs. And their full-time job is to stay in the office, right? So they learn from each other, and they create the mechanisms that convince the public that removal of the dictator is costly. So alternative is worse. The removal is very turbulent, and so they do it pretty well. And so people are afraid of instability, turbulence, and eventually the dictators stay longer. But again, mentioning Asimoglu's research, we know that eventually democratizations happen after a period of economic underperformance. So if you're hit by low economic growth, which is quite likely in those countries, then the dictators go. So eventually, I think the change will come.
Thanks. So I also have two questions, which might sound like three. So the first question would be, would you say that the reforms that have been implemented in the transition countries were influenced by the Washington Consensus? Because I mean, if you look at a lot of them, it kind of looks like they copied a lot and they tried to learn from Latin America. And then also, if so, since you've mentioned a lot of examples where the country itself, that transition has been divided, would you say that like culture in some sense like played a role in the success? And if so, there have also been like some scholars, for example, that argued it has to do with the composition of religion as well. So they say the Orthodox were less successful, or the Catholics were more successful. So what would be your comment on that? And then the second question would be, sorry for this long. The second question would be, since you said that we need to make sure that the losers don't lose out, and you mentioned the safety nets, the social security nets, how can we actually achieve that in aging societies where we have not that many people contributing to the social security funds?
Thank you. So first, let me defend Washington Consensus. So if you actually ask people what Washington Consensus is, people usually think it's about privatization, liberalization, and opening up to foreign trade. While the Washington Consensus actually has 10 items, which does include social safety nets, which does include private property rights, and also it includes something which I think is also very important, broad-based taxes, broadening the tax base and reducing the tax rate. And I think this is also a very important part of the inclusion, fairness, that everybody pays taxes, not just those stupid few who don't want to evade taxation. So I think Washington Consensus is not that naive. It's just in many cases governments didn't have time, didn't have desire to implement it in that way. And in that sense, I won't really say that Washington Consensus is to blame. Of course, we learned much more about the importance of institutions and much more about the importance of political economy. I would say that if you go back 30 years and ask economists what institutions are, people would really talk about institutions. And in 1990s, it started to be clear that institutions are important. For example, this year, the Society of Institutional and Organizational Economics has its 20th annual conference, which kind of suggests that the first conference was, whatever, 97. And before that, people like Coase, Williamson, North, Ostrom didn't get much prominence. And transition economists kind of thought that institutions are important. And then political economy also emerged as the key field in that respect. So I won't say Washington Consensus is problematic. Now, religion and culture play a huge role. It's very hard to separate the role of religion from your history, as I mentioned, of being in this empire or that empire. And that's the only way to figure that out is actually to look at discontinuities or border effects. You're part of the same country now, Poland, but you used to be on different sides of Prussian-Austrian border 100 years ago, right? And so that what kind of gives you the results. But there are very few episodes like this, which allow you to do this. On religion, I wouldn't comment exactly because religion overall coincides with the border between pretty much Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And there it's very hard to separate those things. Now there is some research which looks at it, and usually the researchers say that there are horizontal and vertical religions. Catholic, Orthodox, and Muslims, I think are supposed to be vertical, and Protestant and Jewish are supposed to be horizontal, and so the social capital is higher in the latter, and it's better for distributing the gains of growth or compensating the losers, what have you. Now, I don't want to go on into this discussion because it may become too sensitive. But on your last question was social safety nets. Right? How to build social safety nets if we don't have money. Now, if the reform is such that it doesn't pay off for itself, in the sense that there is no redistributive scheme that makes everybody better off, then maybe you don't need this reform. Okay? So if this reform will pay off for itself in the future, so the future generations, the kids who are not able to vote now, or the kids who are not born yet, will benefit from this, that's a different story. That means you have to borrow. And as I said, you need financial markets for that. So if you know that this reform will pay for itself in 20 years or 30 years, that means that you have to have developed financial markets where you can borrow for 20 or 30 years. Unfortunately, for most transition countries, this is not the case, and this is a problem. And this is why we have institutions like IMF, World Bank, EBRD, and so on. Institutions that can come in and say, here is your 20-year loan, or 10-year loan at least. And I think this is very important.
Professor Guriev, thanks for coming and for this wonderful lecture and for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. My question is regarding the Ukraine and the recent revolution, if you can call it this way. Did we see a genuine reversal of the course that the country is going, or is it just yet another round of opportunists that you mentioned before, who have no ideology and they just took the opportunity to come to power and they're not really interested in where the country is going? So is there something positive to expect?
So if I should have been able, I should be able to answer your question, and I should be able to say, given this 25 years of lessons, I can predict now what's going to happen to Ukraine, right? But being an academic, I can't really say. And I think we still don't know much. It's still speculation, and we are still not sure what's going to happen to Ukraine. I think there are many reasons to believe that Ukraine is moving in the right direction. And I think it's much slower, exactly for the reasons that I mentioned. But I think there are some elements of those institutions that I mentioned that push the government into the direction of being more accountable, transparent, and committed to the course of the reforms. And this element now is probably civil society. So EBRD thinks in those terms. So there is civil society that thinks that the sacrifices made during the revolution do not allow to let reversal happen again. So these sacrifices should push forward whatever happens. And so you have oligarchs outside the government, inside the government, you have civil society in the parliament and in the street, which says you have to clean out, you have to push. And on top of that, you have external accountability to Western donors, which I think in this case is quite useful. Also because Western donors also learned a lot of lessons from 25 years and trying to focus on things like fighting corruption, like competition policy, and so on. And I think in that sense, the progress is slower than it was promised. But if you ask me 2 years ago, where we would be in 2 years, I would expect much less because of those lessons. And you have the Anti-Corruption Bureau established, you have some cleaning up of the bureaucracy, you have some success in the central bank monetary policy budget, you have reform of energy prices, and in that sense, a lot has happened which I wouldn't have expected if you asked me 2 years ago. But much more remains to be done. And in that sense, I think we still should have doubts.
Good afternoon. You said that one of the most important things in order to have fair institutions is to have a multi-partisan democracy. My question is, which is, in your opinion, the best way in order to create this kind of democracy in countries that had experimented authoritarian regimes? I think about countries like Libya, for example, in which this process has maybe produced more damage than pros. Thank you.
Thanks. I think, as Guido just mentioned, the best way to have a democracy is to have democratic history. Right? So you better have inherited democratic history, then it will be easier to build a democracy. But seriously, I think the honest answer to your question is we don't really know.